What I've been going through this year is a little Screwtape devotional, some little bit of wisdom from Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. But I'm going to do something slightly different today because we are beginning a series on hell and Satan and the devil. And so today I'm going to just tell you a few things from Lewis's preface. When he republished it many years later, he wrote a lengthier preface that's not always in the edition. Depends what edition you have. But I'm going to give you just a few tidbits and insights from Lewis about the devil, so we're not going to be fooled. First of all, I hope we all know this. The devil is not the opposite of God. The devil is the opposite of who? Somebody like who or who? The devil would be the opposite of the Archangel Michael or the Archangel Gabriel, right? Because Satan was an archangel who fell. So it's not, this is not God over here and Satan. It's God over here, and here are the angels, and here are the devils, right? So first we have to understand that. There is no such thing as pure evil. Evil is spoiled goodness, as Lewis, going back to St. Augustine, explains. Okay, a few other things. Lewis loved Milton, but he knew that there was a weakness to Milton, that Milton sometimes made his devils look a little too grandiose and tragic and larger than life, and he preferred, as I do, the devils that appear in Dante's Divine Comedy, because they are, as he says, full of rage, spite, and obscenity. That's much closer to what a devil's like. And Lewis, like me, was a big fan of Goethe's Faust. But he said the problem is that his devil, whose name is Mephistopheles, he makes him like a suave, debonair man about town, very humorous, very elite. And he makes Faust, all focused on his sin and focused on his power. And what Lewis explains, I think he's absolutely right. He says, the really pernicious image is Goethe's Mephistopheles. It is Faust, not he, Mephistopheles, who really exhibits the ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration upon self, which is the mark of hell. Today, we would say absolutely narcissistic, absolutely turned on itself, and cares nothing for anyone. He says, the humorous, civilized, sensible, adaptable Mephistopheles has helped to strengthen the illusion that evil is liberating. There's nothing liberating, there's nothing funny, there's nothing urbane or witty about evil. Evil is just dead and resentful and envious. As he goes on to explain, the one thing the devil doesn't know anything about is humor. There's nothing funny about hell. There is no humor there. He says that whatever else we attribute to beings who sin through pride, we must not attribute humor and, sort of light conversation. He says, Chesterton says that Satan fell through force of gravity. We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone believes the deadly, serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment, which is what America is starting to look like, frighteningly enough. That's the real nature, or I'll use my own language. Satan is more like a little boy who would rather break his toys than let the other children play with it. That's the real nature. And what Lewis does is he depicts hell as a nasty dog-eat-dog bureaucracy. As Lewis and others mentioned, the horror of the Holocaust was not perpetrated by these, giant, vicious warriors. It was all orchestrated by little bureaucratic men with bowler hats and three-piece suits sitting in a room. And so that's how Lewis depicts hell, as a nasty dog-eat-dog bureaucracy. And finally, the last point, he says, his image of the devils is that they devour our souls. It's his image of what evil really wants to do, is to suck everything into itself. And this is what it's like. He says, we can see the satanic in human beings this way. He says, even in human life, we have seen the passion to dominate, almost to digest one's fellow, to make his whole intellectual and emotional life merely an extension of one's own, to hate one's hatred and resent one's grievances and indulge one's egoism through him as well as through oneself. So before we start this series on hell and the devil, we have to de-heroize the devil. There's nothing heroic. There's nothing exciting. The devil is a grudge, okay, of endless grievance, endless hatred that sucks the life out of everything. So we need to stop saying, I want to go to hell because they have the best parties and that's where my friends are, okay? And I'll talk more about that in my lecture. But kind of keep that in mind, and let's turn it over because I'm ready to hear what Dr. Blackwell has to say. Great.
Have some handouts here. If we have a volunteer that'd like to hand out handouts, that'd be great. And if not, Caitlin. All right. There's only 25, so just here you go. Yeah, both of you would be fine. There's only 25 handouts, so take them. There we go. It's what we call in the golf world a good recovery. We no, it's yeah, it's fine. So yeah, just share the handouts around. If you want more after the lecture, let me know. I'll make copies for you. So our first, this is, of course, you guys may know, first in the series of 4 meetings focused on this one subject. And we're excited to do it. I think it's going to bring a lot of discussion. Be sure to, get the discussion questions going. I'm going to do it this way. I should have had it up here on the board or whatever, but if you got your cell phone out, that's right. I'm asking you to take your cell phone out. Put my number in your phone, 606-272-3387. I'll repeat it again in just a second. If you have a question, text it to me and I will go through the questions and get them to Dr. Blackwell at the end of it. Okay. So that keeps it anonymous. If you want to ask questions personally, I'll give time for that too. But if you want to ask anonymous questions, my number is 606-272-3387. That is a Kentucky number in case you're wondering. So yeah. Dr. Blackwell went to right up the road here, Dallas Theological Seminary for seminary education, went to Durham, England for his PhD, right? And so, and he's the author of a great little book that I got a copy from him like last year, Engaging Theology, and how to talk about theology across all the different lines. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Blackwell and just give him a hand as he's coming up here to speak to us tonight.
All right, well, it's great to be here with y'all. I've got to confess, this is my first time at Ratio Christi, and so heard great things, and so happy to come and participate with you and think through these ideas. And I want to start, I know part of this, the series is about hell, but I wanted to contextualize the problem of hell, the question of hell, in light of the problem of evil, and particularly the problem of, or the activity of the devil as essential to the problem of evil, because oftentimes we think of hell as made for people like us, right, that sin and are cast into hell. And yet the Bible says that hell was made for Satan and his demons. And so sometimes when we want to recast hell or think that it's not there, then we have to then ask the question, well, what about the whole issue of the devil and the problem of evil that way? And so I'm going to come at it from, I'll teach you a new word. We're a big board gaming family, and the word orthogonal means coming at it from a perpendicular. So I'm going to come at the idea of hell from a different angle than maybe sometimes that you think about. But I want to start off with this. There's a couple in my home group at my church, and the husband recently told his wife that he doesn't believe anymore like they used to believe. They've been Christians, they've gone to church their whole life. And part of it is he was looking back over his life that these tragic events that had happened to them. And so in particularly, he had been, sorry about that. defrauded by an employee that he had. In fact, the employee stole all their customers, right, and went to a competitor, and then they ended up going bankrupt. And it was a guy that named himself as a Christian that did that. And so he has these series of tragic events and things like this that had happened in his life. And it was this problem of evil that led him to leave the faith. And so it was this, oftentimes we think of these more rational arguments of why people leave the faith, but it was more of a heart issue for him, in the sense of like when we experience evil, it's what left him, right? It wasn't some rational argument about all these things. It was more kind of at that heart level than at the head level, maybe we might say, of why he decided that Christianity was not real. And so this idea that I want to set up for you is that this question of how do we perceive the problem of evil? And oftentimes, one of the major philosophical arguments for this is the free will defense, right? That God allows us as free agents to do these things. And philosophically, we come back to this idea that God allows people to do this. And in fact, I've talked to several former students that have gone on to other places and things. They'll have philosophy of religion classes, even at Christian universities, that talk about the problem of evil. In fact, there'll be whole courses on the problem of evil, and yet they won't ever speak about the devil there, because the whole idea is that the problem resides in us, not somewhere else. And so with that, I'm going to argue that we need to come back and see kind of the narrative of Scripture as the way to understand this. We need a story. We need a way to help people like my friend who lost his faith, a way to understand the nature of evil. So let me give you a story here. In fact, this is a true story. As a professor, in fact, I got to have dinner with a graduate last night. So after you graduate HBU, call your professors up and tell us how you're doing in a few years. So I had a former student who's working in a church now, and it was great. This isn't his story, this is another story, but a student recently came to me, and I hear lots of stories, some great like last night, and others like this that are a bit more tragic. He told me that he's been struggling for quite a while with some financial pressures. And in fact, they had been increased so much that he had to reach out for help. In fact, what was the source of that is he's been doing drugs, right? And he's been spending thousands of dollars actually over the past years doing this. And in the end, right, he's feeling like he can't go on. In fact, the crazy thing is he's like, I'm not even sure I'll be here a year from now because of this. And so he's like, I can't go on. And the whole idea is with these drugs is that even though I can't go on without them, they're still poisoning his body. And it's all been a struggle for him, and not just him, but his whole family. And so his family is thinking about checking him into a clinic. And so this was a crazy, tragic story. But it turns out, what if I told you the story is it's not illegal drugs that he's taking, but he has cancer, right? These drugs are poisoning his body. He's not sure he's alive. And so the whole idea here is that if you have the story wrong, you're going to interpret the facts wrong, right? And so what I'm going to do here is try to re-narrate the story from a biblical angle and not just a philosophical angle about the problem of evil. In this sense that the Bible recasts or sets the cast of the problem of evil in light of the devil and his work in the world. And it's not just about us doing bad things, or even more so, and a worse problem that we have is that God is the one that's doing these bad things to us. So this story, why do we need a different story? Well, on the handout, I have there the idea of disenchantment. If you think about the idea of the modern world, one of the words or descriptions of the modern world is that we live in a disenchanted world. We don't think of angels and demons anymore. We don't think about the devil as an active agent. And part of this has to do with the idea of deism, to where God has been so pushed off the stage, like he's just some God up there. And the world down here just runs through mechanistic events, right? This is the scientific worldview, right? You have material causes and effects that cause things to happen. And so, for instance, if you get sick, right, there's a material cause and effect for that. There's a virus, there's some kind of physical effect. It's not demonic, it's not other spiritual activities, because we live in a disenchanted world. That's our whole idea. And what happens in this disenchanted world is we often still think of God as being up there, right? There's a deistic God. So of course there are atheists that say there is no God, and so everything's materialist. But in a Western kind of, perhaps in North America, we still perceive of some benevolent being or quasi-benevolent being up in the sky, but there is no devil. And so what happens when we down here encounter evil? What happens for my friend when he gets defrauded by somebody that says they're Christian? What happens when murders, all these other gratuitous evil acts happen? If it's just us down here and God up there and there's no devil in the equation, then the story is that, well, we don't usually want to blame ourselves. And so who gets the blame then? God does. And so deism, this mechanistic worldview where God is the only spiritual being out there, actually is easily the halfway house to atheism. Because who wants to believe in a God who just lets this stuff happen, right? And so part of my argument here is that if you don't believe in the devil, culturally, we will not end up believing in God as well. So I'll say it more directly here. I think you need to believe in the devil in order to believe in God. And so we're going to talk through that, how the Bible lays that out, because it comes back to framing that story, right? We all experience suffering and evil things. And if we can't interpret those evil things in light of a coherent narrative, a biblical narrative, then we're going to interpret those facts in a wrong way. And we'll say that God's the one that's the cause of this evil rather than these things. So we need to live in a re-enchanted world. And of course, this actually, it's great to be teed off by a discussion of C.S. Lewis, because this is Lewis's whole purpose, is to re-enchant the world, right? He's leading us back to a medieval and even to the early church world where we see that more is going on than what your eyes will see, right? You have to see beyond just the physical. And so in that sense, Lewis is a great prophet of what I'm doing here, and I'm just filling in some of the biblical details. So let me spell this out. Now, the Bible itself doesn't speak a lot about Satan, particularly in the Old Testament. Now, there are some texts, we're going to talk about Job, Genesis 3, Satan shows up. But so much of the Bible, when it starts to articulate the nature of the problem of evil, comes from this fancy word, apocalyptic eschatology. And we get this mostly from the prophets in the Old Testament. So the book of Daniel, for instance, or even Jeremiah, Zechariah. So they're on the latter end of the Old Testament. And this is where you start to see more overt demonic or evil activity in this. And what the prophets are doing, so much of the prophets, they're dealing with the problem of evil. Why are God's people suffering? Now, sometimes they're suffering because they were sinful, right? Sin is like a magnet to suffering. And so if you do bad things, right, it attracts suffering to you. But oftentimes in the story of the Bible is that righteous people suffer, right? This is at the heart, actually, of the Christian narrative. Jesus, as the most righteous person in the world, suffered. And so that we have to deal with this problem of evil. It's not just caused by human sin. But the whole idea of eschatology is that evil is here and now, and there's a hope for the future, right? It comes from the word eschatos, or last, the end things. And so in the end, God will come and fix, he'll restore the problems that are here right now. And so this is the story of the prophets. This is the story of much of the apocalyptic language of the Bible. In fact, the word apocalypse that we come from, I'll give you a little history lesson here, comes from the New Testament. It comes primarily from the last book of the Bible, the book we call Revelation. The word apocalypse actually means revelation. That's the Greek word for that. And so we think of apocalypse as like, you know, some comet's going to hit the earth and all these bad things are going to happen, right? Or you name the dystopian apocalyptic event. The word apocalypse just means a revelation, like the curtains were there and we pull the curtains back and you get to see what's going on behind it. And the whole idea of the revelation is that the people of the church in Revelation are facing crazy amounts of evil. And so when we encounter evil, the whole thing there is like, the question rises, is God in control? And the whole idea of Revelation, this apocalypse, is to see up to that God is in control, even when all this evil is going on down here. And so as we talk about Satan here, it's important to say that it's and his agency, it's not as a way, again, as Dr. Markos said so well, it's not that Satan is equivalent to God up here. The whole idea of the biblical narrative is that God is in control. And for whatever reason in his sovereign wisdom, in fact, I'm not going to answer that question tonight because I don't have an answer. Why does God allow the devil? Right? And there are some steps we can think about that. The Bible actually doesn't answer this question. For instance, in Genesis 3, the serpent just shows up, right? In Job, you just have Satan up in heaven as this accuser against Job. It doesn't say where he comes from or why that happens. And of course, there are texts that talk about, that allude to Satan falling and things like this, or and so they're drawn out, but they're allusions. Okay. So the important thing here is that God is active, but he allows Satan to be active as well. And so much the problem of evil that we see in the Bible is related to this. Okay, so there in the re-enchantment, I'm not going to walk through all of these things, but as with the demonic and the sources of evil, as the source of evil, we see that there. Genesis 3, the serpent you'll be aware of. Job is a righteous man, and Satan is there to come and bring suffering. One of the things that you may not be aware of is in Second Temple Judaism. So the first temple was built by Solomon, right? And of course, when the Babylonians came, they destroyed the second temple. And about that time is when the Old Testament ends. And then there's the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Sometimes you'll hear that called the intertestamental time. In academic speak, we call that Second Temple Judaism. Why do we call it that? That's because that's when the second temple was rebuilt, right? And so this is the temple that Jesus and the disciples and other Christians there. So it's that time frame. It's this the version of Judaism that Christianity arose within. And so part of that is helping us understand what's going on with Christianity. And so there's this whole tradition of text in Second Temple Judaism that help us understand the New Testament. And one of those texts is called 1 Enoch. There's another called Jubilees, that they're re-narrating, retelling biblical texts. And one of the things that they focus on is like with Noah and the sons of God, right? The women in that story have sex with these and kids with these sons of God. In Genesis, it doesn't really explain who these sons of gods are. And so these texts start to spell out what they think they are, right? And they would say they're angelic beings there. And so these watchers. And so what happens during this time frame is the Old Testament has these pockets or windows where the demonic or the spiritual shows up. But it's during the Second Temple period when there becomes a whole lot more speculation and consideration about this spiritual activity. And so you have all these angels and archangels that are named and that come out of this. So Uriel, and in fact, probably as I talk about Satan here, it's important to say, like, I'm guessing in a room like this today, it's not these ancient texts that inform our view of Satan. It's more Lucifer, the Netflix series, right? And you have these different angels and archangels that are named in these texts. Well, they actually come from these ancient Jewish texts. That's where a lot of these names of these other, and of course, as Dr. Markos said, like a part of that whole idea is like Lucifer, if you get the wrong story, and of course the whole story of that show is to recast Lucifer as a nice guy. In fact, he's helping people, right? He is a misunderstood, whatever. I'm not exactly sure what the other than minimizing our understanding of evil, I'm not sure, maybe it's a good story or whatever that draws people in. At any rate, by the time we get to the New Testament, though, the demonic is quite prevalent, right? So Jesus, he's baptized, he's sent out into the wilderness. What is he? He's tempted for 40 days by Satan, right? Satan's there. One of the very first things that Jesus does is has encounters with demonic oppressed people, right? And he's casting out demons. In fact, there's dozens of examples in the Gospels of Jesus casting out demons. In fact, it's a very interesting question. When you think about what is it about Christianity that you know most today? Preaching sermons, singing songs. If you just read the Gospels and you said, hey, I want to do Christianity like the Gospels present it, then exorcism actually would be a much larger portion of our. And of course, other parts of the world, this is a part of Christianity. In fact, ancient Christianity, all ancient baptisms, you had to be exorcised, everybody did, before you became a Christian. Because there are two kingdoms, the way the Gospels play it out, there are two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of Satan, and there's the kingdom of God. And there's no like, we live in a world of secularism where there's like radical evil over here, right? Who's radical evil? Hitler, Stalin, pick your political figure you don't like, whatever today, right? You stick them over there. And then there's the good, radical good, right? So you got the missionaries, you've got holy things over here. But most of the life we live in is just this neutral, secular space in between. And we can live here and you don't have to be religious. You don't have to do anything like that, right? In the ancient world, it's not that way, right? There is no secular space in that sense. You're either in the kingdom of Satan or you're in the kingdom of God. And so ancient Christians, part of the baptismal ceremony was you would turn to the West and they would ask you the question, do you reject Satan and all his ways? And then you would turn to the East and they would ask you, do you believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, believing Jesus Christ, his only son? And so part of that whole thing is like, for you to be a Christian is rejecting the kingdom of Satan. And of course, that's not part of our framework. It's not part of the myth, as we might say, and not a myth in a bad sense, as a fake sense, but it's a myth that makes sense of the world for us. We have the wrong story, and so we misinterpret the facts that lay before us. And so we have to come back to the story that the Bible is laying out for us, and that clearly the demonic was important for Jesus. And if it's not important for us, we have to ask, is that because the Bible led us to that, or is it because some other story has led us to that? And it's a whole lot easier to say, actually, it was the Enlightenment, it was modernism that is the narrative by which we as Christians more live our lives by rather than the biblical narrative. And so we see this, that Jesus is doing these things to respond to that. So there, I'll just point out a handful of text you have there. So Hebrews 2:14 that speaks about this. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too, Christ, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. So why did Jesus even come? Is it just to die and save us from our sins? Well, it's not less than that. But actually, the whole idea of the biblical narrative is like, it's not just that we've chosen to be in the devil's camp, we've been mastered by the devil. We're held captive and we need to be ransomed away, right? We need to be, the word redeemed is a slave market term, right? That you have been bought out of, we are enslaved by the devil, and Christ then is drawing us out. And so you have all these texts then that speak about the devil as controlling us and Christ coming to destroy that work, right? What is 1 John 3:8 there? The one who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. And the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. Do you get that? You don't understand Jesus correctly if you don't have the story right. And if it's just about us doing evil, right, then, and we come to the problem of hell, it's all about us, and it's all about people that we, right, or these really evil people over here, at least, might consider that they might go to hell or something. But the whole idea is about, there's a whole narrative that undergirds the problem of evil. And if we just resolve it through rational argumentation about free agents and things like this, and excise the devil from the narrative, then we actually misunderstand what Jesus is doing and how we fit into that. And then therefore how hell fits within that. Okay, so what I'll do then is just come to the end and point out these couple of key passages that mark us out for the question of the problem of evil. And Matthew 25 is a classic text. We see a lot of artwork around this text. It's Jesus coming and separating out the sheep from the goats. So those that are righteous, those that are following Jesus, go to his right, they're the sheep. And the goats go to his left, right? And so it talks about the punishment, in fact, the eternal fire. But why are they on the left? It's because he says there in Matthew 25:41, that depart from me, you're cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And so again, it comes back to this question, why does hell exist and punishment exist in the Bible? Well, it's not just for bad people. It actually exists in the first place to deal with the problem of evil. And again, all these apocalyptic texts, when we think of Revelation, let's come to Revelation. Revelation 20. There are 22 chapters in Revelation, right? So chapter 20 is at the very end of all this. This is when everything starts to get resolved. In fact, the problem of evil gets resolved in chapter 20, and then 21 and 22 are just the blessed hereafter. And so what happens in chapter 20, the devil, right, is there, and Christ comes back for 1,000-year reign. So the whole idea, you may have heard of the millennium, and there are all these debates about the premillennial return of Christ or amillennial and things like this. It has to do with this 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth is what that millennium points to. But in the midst of that discussion, it talks about the devil who was there to deceive the people, right? And so this is our text here in Revelation 20, verse 10. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they were tormented day and night forever and ever. Again, it comes back to this idea that hell is not just for people. And what happens is there's this narrative that there are two kingdoms out there. And so there's this balance of the sense that not only does the devil lead people into sin, we collude with the devil, right? We partner with the devil in our sin. And so who's punished for this? Well, the devil is for tempting, but also it has the issues here of the people, right, who collude with the devil and therefore get drawn up into his kingdom there. Now, I'm not going to answer all the questions. In fact, I'll be back and there'll be other kind of discussion over the next couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, about the nature of hell. Is it eternal? Is it or annihilationist? The whole idea there. So maybe just to lay out some of the terms there. So our classic view of hell is that we kind of grow up with here is that hell is an eternal and conscious torment. In that sense, like it lasts forever, and everybody is conscious forever into another growing of interest, and partially it has to do with different ontologies. The way nature just works is that if God is the source of being, and then going back to Augustine again and Lewis here, that the further away you get from God, the less being there is, right? It's not that evil is something that exists. It's actually a perversion of what is there. And so some would argue that if you're fully separated from God, you just have no existence at all. You cease to exist. And that is called annihilationism. And so there is a punishment, right? And some will tie it back to the fire language of hell. So if you put a log in a fire, piece of paper, what happens to it? Does it burn forever? No, eventually the material there burns up. And so that's the whole idea, is like this punishment, it's an eternal punishment, right? You cease to exist forever, but it's not eternal conscious torment, right? It's something that it would be temporary in that kind of sense. And of course, there's other versions of that. But in that sense, one thing that's important here is if we're reading the problem of evil, the issue of hell, in light of this larger narrative, we can't just make it about us or people or evil people we know, right? The biblical narrative says the problem of evil resides with the demonic, and that we as people are drawn up into that. And of course, Christ comes to redeem us from that. And so as the problem of evil is resolved, and God, this apocalyptic victory, right? The apocalypse, the victory, right, is the apocalypse, remember, is a revelation. We're looking behind the curtain to see that God is still in control. And the whole idea of eschatology is things are broken now, right? And this is the whole idea. Righteous people are suffering. But the hope is, and the reality is, God is going to come in the future and bring restoration. And that's the real hope of these texts, right? Is that righteous people will experience the blessing that God intended them to have and not suffer. But for us to experience that, then God has to put an end to evil. And so part of this hell narrative is part of God locking Satan up so that he can't continue to give this problem of evil to us. And so in that sense, as we enter in, so in a lot of ways, what I'm giving you is a prelude to a discussion of hell. Why does the Bible say it even exists? In the first place, it's there to deal with this demonic evil that is drawing us in. And as God locks up the devil, then we as his people can experience the blessing and life that he intended for us to have in the first place. So that, I think, hits that. So got the number where I wrote down. It's 606-272-3387, or I will take questions from the floor. What's the preference there?
1 minute and let you guys just talk around your table and let's see if a question comes out of that. We're gonna reformat this little area up here and move a couple chairs over so we can sit down and talk and it not look awkward up here. So take about a minute or two, talk around the table. We'll disrupt you here in just a minute.
We'll still look awkward even when we're sitting down, but that's okay.
We can't hear you.
Refocus. Like I said, if you have a fresh question, text it to me. We've got plenty of good Q&A time here. So if you have a good question, text it over to me at 606-272-3387. Just save my number there. We'll be using that for the rest of the semester as well. Ready for our Q&A? Okay.
I was telling him I used up all my knowledge on this topic, so you know.
First question is more of a practical one, Dr. Blackwell. Can everybody hear me pretty well? Everybody hear me good? This come from a dear friend of mine. What could we do to wake up the people who follow God but do not practice humility, compassion, and love for the lowliest among us? Now, I know it's not exactly like problem of evil, but it's kind of a, what do we do to wake up given this knowledge?
Yeah, I think it comes to sometimes the reason we lack compassion is because we assume people are actively choosing their own fate. And so one of the aspects of the biblical narrative is that people I'm a fan of the idea of non-competitive agency in this sense that it's when we think of spiritual realities. So competitive agency is a fancy term that says either God or the devil makes me do it and I don't have any responsibility, or the opposite is like I have 100% responsibility and God and this demonic stuff can't have any control over me. And usually it's because we view that way because we just don't think they even exist or they're not active, right? So that's competitive agency. It has to be a zero-sum game, either stuff that I do it or they force me to do it. A non-competitive version of agency, like causation, who is that, it's both and that's part of the biblical narrative. It's like we don't come to Christ on our own, the Spirit leads us to that, right? So it's not just our own action, and yet it's not, I don't believe that God just predetermines everything like that without us choosing as well. So, but I don't see them as competitive, I see them as non-competitive. But that works just in the same way with evil. So anybody you see that's struggling with evil, right, that is an evil person, right, or has evil within them, that in the biblical narrative, it's not just their own choice, that they are captive to this kingdom of Satan. And so if the question was, how do we as people become more compassionate? Part of this is reframing the whole narrative, that it's not just this person who is my combatant. Actually, that person is under the influence, I guess. Maybe that's a good way, a term that we would, so sometimes the culpability, if somebody is drinking and driving, we don't hold them to the same level of responsibility as if somebody does a premeditated act, right? And so, but if we reframe this, the devil and the satanic power is active out there, then they're under the influence. And so they're not 100%, right? It's not a simple, the devil made me do it, right? Because I think we still have agency, but we're colluding with the devil in that. And so in that sense, that if we see people as much victims as they are singular agents or whatever, then we approach people differently when we see them struggling with different problems.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. I've actually had quite a few questions similar to this, so I'm just going to try to put them all together, synthesize them here. This was actually kind of my question too. You kind of hit one of my heartstrings. I came from a part of America that some parts of it closely resemble a third world country type poverty. And I don't like to use that word third world, but you know what I'm talking about. With that, though, was what we like to call superstition that comes along with that. part of their superstition I actually admired is that they, if the Bible said it, they really believed it. You know, they believed that we're either part of one kingdom or the other, you know, part of the kingdom of the devil or kingdom of God.
Mhm.
And part of that was that we actually, in my ministry back in Kentucky, I saw with my own eyes about 8 exorcisms. 3 of them were very vivid, and I can say for sure. I've often said the question just like this. I wanted to preface that to say, like, this is in my heart. I'll ask it the way I think the way the student asked it was better. She said, talking about normalizing exorcism, please discuss how we could address the normalization of demonic influence in New Age and spiritual worldviews. Follow-up question with that: how do we wake up believing but, quote, non-spiritual Christians to the reality of the demonic spiritual influence and warfare?
Yeah, so for me, like, part of this is I go to a Vineyard church. It's a Baptistic, very similar to Baptist, but it's a charismatic denomination. And I think part of this re-enchantment is part of, I think, important for myself, is that we encounter spiritual realities, right? Or that we re-engage that narrative. And so the charismatic movement over the last 100 years has been active in that movement in the West now. And so you don't have to be charismatic to engage these things. You know, there are different forms of engaging these realities that are outside the charismatic world. But I do think that that helps re-engage that. And there are better and worse ways of that. I go to a Vineyard church, and so one of the professors here calls us charismatics with our seatbelts on. I like to describe us as one-handed charismatic. So we only raise one hand at the time when we're singing instead of both, you know. But so in that sense, like, you don't want to see a devil under every bush. Sometimes people are just they're just mean people, right? It doesn't, you know, or it doesn't have to overtly be this demonic, or they're not demonically oppressed, right? In the sense that we see. And so in that same way that, like, mental health issues, right? I do think, like, some of the issues in the biblical text that might be ascribed to demonic things would be hard for us to distinguish from contemporary mental health issues. And, you know, and so we don't want to go to the other side to where it's all just medical issues and that you can treat everything with just a drug. Because I think sometimes we just mute that, you know, like, we treat the symptom and not the cause and all these things. And so it's a both and, right? It doesn't have to be only demonic. It doesn't have to only be natural things there. What I would say here is, like, the majority of Christians around the world actually believe this. It's only Christians in the West, in North America and Europe, that really struggle with this separation. So if you go to Christians in Africa or Latin America, like, they understand these power encounters. And so I'd encourage you, like, there's some, and if you're interested, you can email me, but there's 3 basic worldviews of the way things work in the world. We live in a guilt and innocence culture. It's very legal based. And so we think that there are these structures like that run the world. There are honor and shame cultures. That's a second kind of culture. And so the biblical text deals a lot with this and the honor and shame, but there's also power and fear cultures. And so the biblical text engages all 3 of these. And so we in the modern West, though, work mostly with the guilt and innocence. And so we easily filter out of the narrative honor and shame, but then also guilt, fear and power. And so particularly when we're talking about this issue of the demonic here, is like these other parts of the world engage much more strongly. So if you you know, travel to the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, things like this, it's much more common to hear Christians speak in this way. And so what I'm arguing is that actually it's not like the modern West has everything right, and it would be great if everybody tags along with us. We need to learn as much from them about how to read the Bible well as they might learn from some of our things.
It kind of, along with that, it kind of reminds me of Francis Schaeffer's ideas. At least, I've been reading a lot of him lately for one of my classes, and I immediately, when I saw that question, thought about that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's that secular sacred split that we tend to put sacred up here as like a leap of faith. We don't really need rationality to get to it, but then down here you've got the secular world, and that's more relying upon our empiricism, like empirical data,
Yeah.
And so, but the devil operates in this world in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you can see that, especially I think in this department, like just how that's taken hold in our culture in the West.
Yeah, I would say like fundamentally the sacred secular divide is one of the most damaging worldview ideas that the church has inhabited. If we want to take a step back, and something that most Christians would affirm, but we don't really think about in this way, is there any space on earth that God is not the Lord of? Right? So there is no secular space that God is not in control of. And in that same sense, there is no space that Satan's not trying to attack. And so there is no secular space. It's a construct that we in the Enlightenment and modernism have created. And part of it was there so that we had public discourse, a place for public discourse where Protestants and Catholics didn't fight about, and so it has a function, a social function. But what happens is we took that social function and applied it to what philosophers call ontology, the nature of being. And there is no being, there is no isness that is not under God's control or his authority. And so there is no place that God is not Lord or Christ is Lord. And in fact, that's part of this whole narrative of the Bible, is to establish that God is Lord even when you see this evil happening.
I'm glad you went there, because that follows up with this next anonymous question from somebody who I actually have their number. So I know where this is coming from, but no, it's good though. I think it's relevant. How do we properly understand and live in light of the devil's reality without living in satanic panic? Dungeons and Dragons, Harry Potter, the Force, and Star Wars are all things that can, at least in some ways, take these things lightly. Does that make them bad? What is a good Christian ethic in relation to this? How would Paul's discussion of food offered to idols play into it? And I'm going to add one more on there. How would Paul's discussion in Acts 17 in Athens apply to that as well?
Yeah. So Acts 17, if you don't know, Paul goes to Athens, Mars Hill, the Areopagus. So you might have heard of that term, but and he says, I see all these idols out there, these to different gods. And in fact, there's all these gods, right? Apollo, Zeus, Hera, all these. And he finds one, just to cover our bases, there's to the unknown God, right? And so Paul says, actually, this unknown God is actually the God of the Jews. And he is known, actually, and he's been revealed by Jesus Christ. And so I think in that sense, like, it's a hard. So I read Harry Potter, right? So I'll put cards on the table there. I've read Harry Potter in German, the whole series. So and so in that sense, I think in this sense that so I'm not one that is looking at things, but it also, like, part of, if we don't see spiritual realities, if we don't grasp that there are these powers out there, then we will engage things unprepared. So let me give you an example. My wife's grandfather worked at the Hanford site up in Washington State. So there were 3 or 4 major nuclear test facilities in the US. So Oak Ridge and, Los Alamos we know of. Well, Hanford's the one up there. And this was back in the 50s and 60s. And so they didn't have the people. He was a pipe fitter. So that meant he was running these pipes to and from these different reactors and things. And he had a friend that they were in some area, and he found like a ball bearing on the floor, picked it up, put it in his pocket, and when they're in some room, and then literally within a week he was dead because it was radioactive, right? And he didn't know it. And of course they didn't have all the OSHA things and all that would protect the workers. And so what is this a story of? There are things that have power for good and for evil that we don't know about. And if we ignore the reality there, the power, it still affects us whether we engage it or not. So I will say, like, Christians throughout history that understood these things weren't always avoid them. So like, let's take C.S. Lewis, for example, here. Like, he uses the word magic. Now, what is he doing? He's trying to translate for us some kind of spiritual power, right? In that terminology, or Tolkien, right? They're trying to re-enchant the world for us. And in this sense, like, Harry Potter does, I think, is as much an opportunity for us to engage people's minds about enchantment as it is something to be concerned with. It's a both and. There's no simple neutral things, right? I'm actually arguing against. There's nothing that is just neutral, but there's nothing as well that, like, is outside of God's lordship, that even what we intend for bad, that God can't use for his purposes as well. So I don't think we should play around. Like, I would never play a Ouija board, right? You're inviting demonic, right? You're inviting it, not just neutrally kind of, and I think it takes wisdom. And so, like, are there people, like, do I think it's bad that people don't read Harry Potter? Like, I understand that conviction. Like, and if you don't do that, I think you're not the worse for it per se in that sense. Like, that level of conviction is not mine, but I understand why people would want to not unintentionally walk into these things.
And I think along with that too, it's like, if we take that approach that we can't engage in something like Harry Potter or something like that, how do you tell somebody who's like in my shoes, for I'm engaging these other cultures? In some of the best evangelism I've had has been in the room of the dead in the Chowtu temple over here, where it's literally believe it's a spiritual portal where spirits come. I mean, you're looking right at the doorway of this, and it's got a real darkness to it. And should we just not ever go there? It's like, I kind of think of it that way in regards to, it depends on if you're going in there to worship the dead, that's one thing. If you're going in there to learn a culture, that's different. And so I think that applies with Harry Potter or any of that too. If you're reading it for entertainment, that's one thing. If you're reading it to learn how to practice witchcraft, that's totally the other.
Well, even and to think about the ancient world, like, if you look at the way the ancient court systems worked, if you went to the court, all the courts were held in some temple, right? They didn't think of secular space either. The gods helped run all these things. And so Christians, to the extent that they participated in ancient culture, had to participate in space that had even been dedicated to gods. And so part of that then is this transition through time in the Roman culture particularly. But, like, what did Daniel do in Babylonia? I mean, they even gave him and his buddies pagan, like, Marduk and all these other names, right? They were named after these pagan gods. So they inhabited spaces, but then were the light of Christ in those spaces as well. So I don't know. I mean, and there's a famous book. Is it Richard Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr? They're two Niebuhr brothers, but called Christ and Culture. And there are different ways that the Bible presents to engage culture. So in Revelation, the book of Revelation is very like us versus them. It's like, don't even touch it. And then other texts are like, no, go and engage that, but be a sanctifying influence within it. And so it's that tension that I think the diversity in the Bible speaks to the diversity of ways Christians can and should engage these different spaces. And different people have different callings, right? And different people have different weaknesses, right? If you have a weakness to alcohol, you don't go hang out in bars. You know, but other people, that's not as their weakness, right? And so I think it's hard to say just one way that all Christians should do something with regard to that.
That's fair. We've got time for one more, and a lot of these questions, guys, man, we had so many questions tonight, and they were all awesome. But we do have two more speakers and a panel coming up too. And I know the other two lectures that are coming are going to answer some of those questions. That's how I've had to, on the fly, decipher through all your questions. I really appreciate it. But this was a good one. This is like more of a philosophical theology question, I think.
Okay.
Is evil the cause of sin, or is sin the cause of evil? And we can end there. And then stick around afterwards if you're interested.
Yeah.
We're going to be giving away a couple of books and stuff if you guys want to stick around.
Okay.
And Ivy, you're going to help with that again, like with the numbering system. Okay, so go ahead. So let me restate it for you. Is evil the cause of sin, or is sin the cause of evil? Ben Blackwell.
Yes. So what I would say is yes. And part of this is like, are people that are sinful under the power of devil, right? And Jesus comes to free us from that. So in that sense, you're not freed from something. You only need to be freed from what is over you and controls you. But then there's also like, and part of this is most texts that talk about hell don't talk about the devil, right? I mean, if they're talking about that, the punishment is for the people that choose to not follow God. And so it's a both and there, that there is human responsibility. And I think this is, you know, the Bible doesn't give everybody an out. Like you can just blame the devil for that. But it also doesn't just say it's all us alone. It's part of this wider narrative that we have to re-enchant ourselves and inhabit this narrative in order to actually understand what's going on around us. And so in that sense, I know that's it's the less philosophically precise argument, right? I think people, you know, if you put everything in nice, neat buckets, that's great. But I think that's part of the benefit of a narrative. A lot of things are not, you know, there are aspects of the narrative that are never resolved. We either fill in the gaps or these kind of things. But it's that tension, the narrative, that actually helps us understand like where we live. Yeah, I would say so, because you can talk, and the sciences, we sometimes talk about correlation and causation, right? Correlation means they go together, but we don't understand the relationship, or we can't articulate that, whereas causation is one comes first and then the other. And I think the way you said it is that they kind of go in and out. So let me say this, like you've heard this phrase before: hurt people, right? There's a cause there, and that cause leads them to do evil things, right? And they hurt other people, right? They're hurt in a past participle sense, and then they hurt people in a present active sense, right? And so that in that sense, it's a both and. So I guess to say yes, I think that's the deal. It's like there is some causation there, but even then, some people generate this out of themselves. We don't always just want to say they're only doing it because something happened to them. Like we're responsible for not forgiving other people, or we're responsible for the other things that we do, for lying and all these actions. And the Bible is just not precise about how that happens. Where does Satan come from, right? This is the question. The Bible doesn't say, right? I mean, there are some aspects to the story that we, and so Milton is very good at helping us think through that, and other people in Paradise Lost. I'm 46 this year. It's the first time I ever read Paradise Lost. So if you've never read John Milton, right, then don't feel bad. Read it sometime sooner than later, because he's helping re-enchant that narrative of like what's going on here. But yeah.
And Milton suggests, we just read it, God is speaking, says the devils were self-deceived, and therefore there's no hope. But we were deceived by someone else.
Yeah.
What do you think? Is there not like a verse?
Yeah, no. The other side to that is that Christ, the eternal Son of God, takes on humanity, and it's why humanity can be saved, but not these other. I don't know, but there's varieties of things there. So yeah. So at the same time, other theologians, Maximus the Confessor. So I'll name drop here. Anyhow, he talks about how Christ unites all aspects of nature, and that's. I understand like the human focus, but also the sense that Christ brings together the seen and unseen, and other things that are beyond that. And so, because here's a great question. I'll leave it and we'll end on this. I'm not even going to say anything about it. Like, does Christ's incarnation, if they're aliens on other planets, does his incarnation here as human save them from their, right? That's a different question, but it plays into that same realm.
Well, you just opened up a door that,
Yeah.
and then we're just going to shut it right back.
That's right.
This is why you come to the discussion panel at the end of the series, so you can ask about that. There you go. So yeah, that concludes the portion of Ratio Christi. I know a lot of you guys, this is coming up on midterms. You got a place to go. You're dismissed. Take a pizza with you. If you want to stay for the raffle, we're going to do that very quickly. We have a few items back there. They brought me the list, but not the items. What do we got? We got a hat, got 2 books. Is that what it is? Okay. So you'll go back there to pick up your prizes. So you can choose from a hat. One of them, I think, is Speaking of Homosexuality by Joe Dallas. Tortured for Christ. Yeah, by Word Braun. So, okay. And our number system tonight is 1 through 21. Ivy's going to give me a random number off of Google random number generator, and it is 7. Caitlin Moore. She is like you're a champ, dude. You have won she has won a raffle like every week. It's amazing. Yeah. So there you go. She just keeps winning. She's a winner. Be like Caitlin. Okay. Her next number is 1. Timothy Smith.